I never thought the people who brought me into this world would turn their backs on my child when I was fighting for my life. My name is Elena, and if you are listening to this, I need you to understand something from the very first word. Family is not always the people who share your blood. Sometimes the people who share your blood are the ones who break you the deepest. This is the story of the night everything I believed about love, loyalty, and parents shattered like the glass on that dark highway. This is the story of my daughter Lily, of the crash that almost took us both, and of the quiet man who walked into a hospital room at midnight and changed the direction of our lives forever. I was 26 years old when Lily was born. She came into the world on a rainy Tuesday morning, weighing just over 6 pounds, with a soft patch of dark hair and the tiniest fists I had ever seen. Her father had already left by then. He told me he wasn't ready for a child. He said the timing was wrong, that he needed space, that he still loved me but couldn't stay. I watched him pack a single bag and walk out the door of our small apartment while I was 7 months pregnant. I did not chase him. I did not beg. I simply sat on the edge of the bed, one hand on my stomach, and told myself that I would be enough. I had always believed that if everything else fell apart, my parents would still be there. They lived only 20 minutes away in the same town where I grew up. My mother kept a clean house and a careful smile. My father worked long hours at the same company he had joined at 22. They were not warm people, not the kind who hugged without reason or said, "I love you," at the end of every phone call. Their love came with quiet rules. Do well in school. Do not make noise. Do not bring home trouble. When I told them I was pregnant, the silence on the phone lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally my mother said, "We will support you, Elena. But this changes things." I did not ask what she meant. I was too scared of the answer. Those first 6 weeks with Lily were a blur of exhaustion and fierce, quiet joy. I worked double shifts at the hospital cafeteria, on my feet for hours, pumping milk in the break room between trays. At night I would sit in the old rocking chair I had found at a thrift store and watch her sleep on my chest. Her breathing was soft and steady. Sometimes she would sigh in her sleep and my whole body would loosen. I whispered promises to her in the dark. "It's just us, baby. We are going to be okay. Mommy is going to make sure of it." Some nights I believed those words. Other nights the loneliness pressed against my ribs so hard I could barely inhale. My parents visited twice in those 6 weeks. The first time they brought a small stuffed rabbit and stayed for 40 minutes. My mother held Lily for a few careful minutes, then handed her back and wiped her hands on a tissue. My father stood near the window and talked about the weather. The second visit was even shorter. They said they were busy. They said the house was being painted. They said they would come again soon. I told myself it was fine. New grandparents needed time. I told myself a lot of things in those days just to keep moving. Then came the night of the accident. It was a Thursday. The rain had started in the afternoon and never stopped. By the time I finished my shift it was coming down in sheets, turning the roads into black mirrors. I was exhausted. My eyes burned. My back ached from standing. But Lily was waiting at the small home daycare I paid for with money I barely had, and I needed to get her home, feed her, and somehow find 3 hours of sleep before the next shift. I buckled her into the car seat in the back, checked the straps twice the way I always did, and kissed her forehead. She was already half asleep, one fist curled near her mouth. I remember the sound of the windshield wipers more than anything else. That steady, tired rhythm. Swish. 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 I remember thinking I only had 20 minutes left until home. I remember glancing in the rearview mirror to check on her. And then I remember the headlights. They came too fast and too close. A truck that had drifted across the center line. There was no time to swerve. No time to scream. Only the explosion of impact, the scream of metal, the white bloom of the airbag, and then darkness. When I opened my eyes the world was sideways and full of smoke or steam. My ears rang with a high, thin sound. Something warm ran down the side of my face. I tried to move and pain tore through my left side like fire. But the only thought that cut through everything was her name. Lily. My voice came out broken. I twisted as far as the seatbelt and the pain would allow. Lily, baby, talk to mommy. For one endless second there was nothing. Then a thin, frightened cry rose from the back seat. Relief hit me so hard I almost blacked out again. She was alive. She was crying. She was still here. Hands pulled my door open. Voices shouted over the rain. Someone cut the seatbelt. Someone else was already at the back door reaching for the car seat. I kept saying the same words over and over. Be careful with her. Please. She's only 6 weeks. Please check my baby. They got us both out. 2 ambulances. The cold rain on my face. The bright lights. I remember reaching for her as they loaded me onto the stretcher, my fingers brushing the edge of her blanket before the doors closed between us. I remember the paramedic telling me she was responsive, that they were taking her to the same hospital, that I needed to stay still. I remember staring at the ceiling of the ambulance and counting my breaths because if I stopped counting I would start screaming. At the hospital the pain settled into something sharp and constant. Broken ribs. A concussion. Deep bruising across my chest and hips where the seatbelt had held me. They wanted to keep me overnight for observation. I kept asking for Lily. A nurse with kind eyes finally told me she was in the pediatric unit, checked over, no serious injuries, just shaken and scared. They were waiting for a family member to take her so I could rest and heal. I gave them my parents' number with shaking fingers. I lay on that narrow bed, every breath a knife, and waited. I pictured my mother's face when she heard the news. I imagined my father grabbing his keys, driving through the rain, determined and worried. They would come. Of course they would come. This was their granddaughter. This was me, their only child, lying broken after a crash that could have taken us both. An hour passed. Then another. The nurse returned looking uncomfortable. We reached your parents, she said carefully. They said they can't take the baby tonight. I stared at her. The words did not make sense in my head. What do you mean they can't? She shifted her weight. They said they're not prepared for a newborn right now. They suggested that social services place her temporarily until you're discharged and back on your feet. The room tilted. A rushing sound filled my ears. No. Call them again. Please. Tell them it's me. Tell them Lily is only 6 weeks old. She only knows my smell. She only takes my milk. Please. The nurse's eyes were gentle but firm. I already explained the full situation. They were very clear. I tried to sit up. Pain exploded across my ribs and I fell back against the pillows, tears spilling hot down my temples into my hair. They said no? To their own granddaughter? I'm so sorry. In that moment something inside me cracked wide open. Not just the physical pain. Something older and deeper. The careful, measured love I had always accepted from my parents suddenly showed its true face. Conditional. Distant. And now, when it mattered most, completely absent. I called them myself from the hospital phone, my voice shaking so hard I could barely form the words. My mother answered on the 3rd ring. Her voice was calm, almost businesslike, as if I had called about a grocery list. Elena, we heard. We're very glad you and the baby are both alive. But we can't take a newborn tonight. Your father has an early meeting. The house isn't set up for a baby. It will be better if the hospital handles temporary placement until you're stronger. She's 6 weeks old, I whispered. She doesn't understand temporary. She needs someone who knows her. Please, Mom. There was a long pause. I heard my father's voice in the background, muffled. Then my mother said, "You're being dramatic, Elena. We are not saying never. We are saying not tonight. Try to rest. Dramatic. I hung up the phone and stared at the ceiling while the word echoed inside me. The nurse returned with papers about temporary foster placement. I refused to sign them. I kept repeating that someone else would come. I did not know who. I only knew I could not let them take my daughter to strangers while I lay broken and unable to stop them. And then, just after midnight, the door to my room opened. An older man stood there in a worn jacket and a baseball cap still damp from the rain. He was tall but slightly stooped, with the same dark eyes I saw every time I looked in a mirror. His gaze found mine immediately. "Elena," he said, voice rough with emotion and the long drive. "I'm here. My grandfather." I had not seen him in almost 2 years. There had been some quiet falling out with my parents, something about money, or pride, or the way he spoke too honestly about things they preferred to keep polished. He lived an hour away in a small house near the river. When I was a child I used to spend whole summers with him. He taught me how to bait a hook, how to fix a leaky faucet, how to sit on the back steps in silence without needing to fill the quiet with nervous words. He was the only person who had ever looked at me like I was enough exactly as I was. He walked straight to the bed and took my hand. His fingers were calloused and warm and steady. "I heard," he said simply. "About the crash. About the baby. About them." I started crying then, the kind of crying that comes from the deepest place in the body. He did not tell me to stop. He did not offer empty comfort. He simply held my hand and waited until the worst of the shaking passed. "Where is she?" he asked after a long moment. "Pediatric unit. They want to place her somewhere until I'm out." He straightened his shoulders. For a man in his 70s he suddenly looked unbreakable. "Not while I'm still breathing." What I did not know that night was how far he was willing to go. What I did not know was that my parents' refusal was only the first layer of a much deeper betrayal. And what I did not know was that the quiet old man standing beside my hospital bed was about to become the strongest wall I had ever known. The next hours blurred into a strange mix of pain, relief, and rising tension. Grandpa spoke to every nurse, every social worker, every doctor who would listen. His voice stayed low and steady, but there was steel underneath every word. He produced his identification. He explained that he was my mother's father. He asked what papers were required for temporary guardianship. When they hesitated because of hospital policy and the late hour, he simply said, "Then I will sit in that waiting room until the papers are ready. That child is not leaving this building with strangers tonight." Somehow, by 3 in the morning, they brought Lily to my room in a small clear bassinet. Grandpa had signed every form they put in front of him. The social worker looked more relieved than anything else as she wheeled the bassinet in. When I saw my daughter's face again I reached for her with shaking arms. Grandpa helped settle her against my good side, careful of the monitors and the 4-line. She rooted immediately, searching for me with her mouth, and the moment she latched the tears started again. I fed her while Grandpa stood at the foot of the bed watching us both with an expression I could not fully read: pain, protectiveness, and something that looked like a quiet, final decision. "Rest," he told me. "I will be right here." I slept in short, painful stretches. Every time I woke he was still in the chair by the window, or walking the hallway with Lily when she fussed so I could breathe without moving my broken ribs. He learned the difference between her hungry cry and her tired cry in a single night. He changed diapers with careful, deliberate hands. He hummed old songs under his breath that I remembered from childhood summers. Morning came gray and wet. My parents arrived just after 9. I heard their voices first in the corridor, my mother's polished tone, my father's deeper rumble. When they stepped into the room their eyes went first to Grandpa, then to the baby in my arms, then to me. The air in the room changed instantly. "Dad," my mother said, her voice stiff. "What are you doing here?" "Taking care of my granddaughter and my granddaughter's mother," he answered without raising his voice. "Since no one else would." My father's jaw tightened. We explained the situation to the hospital. We were not prepared for a newborn overnight. That is a reasonable boundary. I looked at them from the bed, Lily still warm against me. You said no. To her. When I was lying here broken and terrified. My mother stepped closer, lowering her voice as if we were having a private disagreement instead of standing inside a public wound. Elena, you are exhausted and in pain. You are not thinking clearly. We would have come in the morning. Temporary placement was the responsible choice. Responsible, I repeated. The word tasted bitter on my tongue. She is 6 weeks old. She does not understand responsible. She only understands whether the people who are supposed to love her show up. Grandpa stood then. He was not a large man, but in that moment he seemed to fill the entire room. You had a choice last night. You chose yourselves. I chose them. That is the end of the discussion for today. My mother's face flushed. You always did this. Undermining us. Making us look like the villains in front of everyone. I am not making you look like anything, Grandpa said quietly. You did that yourselves when you told a hospital you would not take your own blood. They left soon after. The silence they left behind felt heavier than their presence had. Over the following days the truth began to surface in pieces, the way wreckage washes up after a storm. Grandpa stayed. He slept in the chair or on a thin cot the nurses found for him. He learned Lily's every sound. He brought me water and held the cup when my ribs made it too painful to lift my arms. On the third day, while I was drifting in and out of sleep, I overheard him on the phone in the hallway. His voice was low, but certain words carried clearly. Yes, I know what they have been saying about the will. I know they expected the house and the land. I am changing it. Effective immediately. The lawyer is drawing up the papers today. No, I am not discussing it with them first. They made their choice when they left that baby in a hospital. My heart stuttered in my chest. When he came back into the room I asked him directly. He did not hide it. Your parents have been waiting for me to die so they could sell the river house and the land, he said simply, sitting down in the chair again. They have made comments for years. Little ones. About how much the property would be worth in the current market. About how I should simplify my affairs while I still can. When they refused Lily, something in me settled into place. I decided that the people who walk away from a 6-week-old baby in a crisis do not inherit what I built with my own 2 hands. I stared at him, the weight of his words settling over me. You're cutting them out completely? I am protecting what matters. You. Her. The rest is just wood and dirt and paper. The knowledge sat heavy in my chest. Part of me felt a fierce, quiet justice rising. Another part felt the final thin thread between me and my parents snap with a sound only I could hear. When the hospital finally discharged me, Grandpa drove us straight to his house by the river. The place smelled like old wood, strong coffee, and the faint clean scent of the water. He had already set up a bassinet in the small guest room. He had bought extra formula and diapers, just in case, even though I was still nursing. He had cleared a corner and turned an old dresser into a changing table. There was a second-hand rocking chair by the window that looked out over the trees. My parents called that first evening. The messages started careful and concerned. Then they turned irritated. Then cold. You're letting that old man turn you against your own parents. This living situation is temporary, Elena. Do not get comfortable. He is using the baby to get back at us over money that was never his to weaponize. I stopped answering the phone. Weeks passed. My body healed in slow, painful layers. Lily grew. She started smiling, real smiles that lit up her whole face and made the corners of her eyes crinkle. Grandpa would lean over her and make the most ridiculous faces until she laughed that wet, surprised baby laugh that filled the whole house. In those moments the constant ache in my chest loosened just a little. But the betrayal kept revealing new layers, like paint peeling off an old wall. I learned that my parents had told the extended family a completely different version of the accident night. In their telling, I had been difficult and emotional. They had offered help and I had refused out of pride. Grandpa had interfered and escalated a simple misunderstanding. The story traveled quietly through phone calls and group chats. Some relatives reached out with careful, probing questions. Others went completely silent. I sat on the back porch one evening with Lily asleep in my arms, the river moving slow and dark beyond the trees. Grandpa came out with 2 mugs of tea and sat beside me without speaking for a long time. "They're rewriting it," I said finally. "People who cannot face what they did often try to rewrite it," he answered. "That does not make the new version true." I looked down at my daughter's peaceful face. "I keep waiting for the day it stops hurting." "It will hurt less," he said. "Not because the hurt disappears, but because you build something stronger around it. Something they cannot touch." I did not fully understand his words yet. But I was beginning to feel the shift inside me, from broken and begging to something harder, clearer, and more determined. Then the formal letter arrived. It came from a lawyer representing my parents. They were requesting formal visitation rights with Lily. They claimed concern for her well-being in what they called an unstable temporary living situation with an elderly relative. They wanted mediation. They wanted a court-ordered schedule. They wanted control, dressed up carefully as grandparental care and family unity. I read the letter twice at the kitchen table. Then I set it down, walked out the back door, and stood at the edge of the river until the sun started to drop. The water kept moving, indifferent and constant. I thought about the hospital room. The nurse's uncomfortable expression. My mother's calm voice saying they were not prepared. My father's silence in the background. The word dramatic. Something in me finished breaking that afternoon. And then, quietly, it finished hardening into something new. I went back inside, picked up the letter, and looked at Grandpa. "I'm done being the one who stays quiet to keep a peace that was never real," I said. He nodded once, as if he had been waiting for that exact sentence for a long time. The mediation was scheduled for a neutral office in the city 3 weeks later. I dressed carefully that morning, not to impress my parents, but to remind myself that I was no longer the exhausted, broken girl in a hospital gown who had begged them over the phone. I was a mother. I was a survivor. And I was done asking for scraps of care from people who had already shown me their limits. Grandpa came with me. He sat in the waiting area with Lily, reading her a little board book in his low, steady voice while I went into the conference room with the mediator, my parents, and their lawyer. My mother spoke first. Her voice was smooth and practiced. She talked about family unity and the child's right to know both sides of her family. She described the accident night as a misunderstanding under extreme stress. She said they had always intended to help once the immediate crisis passed. I listened to every word. When the mediator turned to me, I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I simply told the truth in the exact order it had happened. I described the crash. The hospital. The call. The precise words, Then I placed a printed copy of the hospital's social work notes on the table. The notes recorded their refusal in black and white. The room went very quiet. My father's face flushed deep red. My mother's mouth tightened into a thin line. Their lawyer shifted in his chair and began shuffling papers that suddenly seemed less important. I continued, still calm. "You had a choice when I was most vulnerable and my daughter was most defenseless. You chose yourselves. Now you want a court-ordered schedule as if that night never happened. I will not pretend it did not happen. Lily will not be used as a tool to rewrite the story into something more comfortable for you." The mediator suggested a cooling-off period and the possibility of limited, supervised contact if I agreed. I did not agree to unsupervised visits. I agreed only to occasional written updates about major milestones, first steps, first words, birthdays, nothing more, until trust was rebuilt. If it ever could be. They left the room angry. The lawyer muttered something about further legal options. I walked out into the waiting area, took Lily from Grandpa's arms, and felt the first real breath of something that felt like freedom enter my lungs. What happened next was quieter than any loud confrontation, and somehow more final. Grandpa finalized the new will within the month. The river house, the land, and everything he owned went into a trust for Lily, with me named as trustee until she reached adulthood. My parents received a formal letter from his lawyer informing them of the change. Their reaction was cold fury followed by a long, brittle silence. They tried one more approach through a relative, a soft, careful invitation to sit down as a family and talk things through. I declined without explaining myself again. The truth had already been spoken. Repeating it would not make them hear it differently. Months turned into a year. Lily took her first steps on the worn wooden floor of Grandpa's living room, her little hands reaching for the edge of the coffee table. She said, "Papa," to him before she said almost any other word. The first time it happened he turned his face toward the window so I would not see the tears, but I saw them anyway. I pretended not to notice until he was ready to wipe them away himself. I found steady work closer to the river, something with regular hours that let me be home in the evenings. I saved every extra dollar. My body finished healing. The physical pain faded into memory. The deeper wound became a scar, still visible if you knew where to look, but no longer open and bleeding. One afternoon I received a message from an old family friend. My parents had been telling people that Grandpa had stolen their granddaughter and poisoned me against them with lies about the accident night. The friend thought I deserved to know what was being said. I sat with that information for a full day. I walked by the river. I held Lily while she napped on my chest. I thought about every version of the story that was floating around without my consent. Then I made a decision. I wrote a single, calm letter. I did not send it to my parents. I sent it to the wider circle of aunts, uncles, and cousins who had only ever heard one side. I attached the hospital's social work notes, with personal details redacted where necessary. I stated the facts without adjectives or accusations. I ended with one clear sentence: I will not debate what happened that night. I will simply live the truth of it, and I will protect my daughter from any version of the story that erases what she went through. Some people never replied. A few sent short, careful messages of support. One cousin wrote back, "I always wondered why they were so quick to judge everyone else's choices." The noise around their rewritten version of events grew quieter after that. Not silent, but quieter. I never received an apology from my parents. Not a real one. There were a couple of stiff messages on Lily's first birthday that mentioned, "hoping we can move forward." I did not answer them. Moving forward did not require me to pretend the past had been different. Grandpa lived long enough to see Lily turn 3. He taught her how to drop pebbles into the river and watch the circles spread. He taught her the names of the birds that came to the feeder. He told her stories about me as a little girl, stories my parents had never bothered to remember. When he passed, it was quiet and peaceful, at home, with both of us beside him. The trust he had set up held. The house by the river stayed ours. My parents contested nothing in the end. Perhaps they finally understood that some doors, once closed, do not reopen. In the years that followed I built a life that did not require their approval. I remarried eventually, a quiet, steady man who loved Lily from the first day he met her and never once made me feel that my past was too heavy. We had another child. The house by the river grew louder and fuller and warmer. On summer evenings I still sit on the back steps the way Grandpa taught me, watching the water, letting the quiet settle around me without fear. People sometimes ask if I hate my parents. The answer is no. Hate would mean they still hold a large space inside me. What I feel is clearer and lighter than hate. I see them exactly as they are. People who loved in a limited, conditional way. People who chose comfort over courage when it mattered most. People who could not face the truth of their own choices, so they tried to rewrite it. The real revenge was never a dramatic confrontation or a public takedown. The real revenge was simpler and much more powerful. It was building a life so steady and full that their absence no longer felt like a wound. It was raising my daughter with the kind of love that shows up at midnight in the rain. It was becoming the parent I had needed, and the grandchild my grandfather had always deserved. If you are listening to this and you have been abandoned by the people who were supposed to protect you, I want you to hear me clearly. Their failure is not a reflection of your worth. Their limits are not your identity. You are allowed to walk away from people who only love you when it is easy. You are allowed to build a family from the ones who stay. And you are allowed to tell the truth of what happened, even if your voice shakes, even if some people never believe you. I used to think the crash was the worst night of my life. Now I know it was the night the truth finally became impossible to ignore. The night my parents said no to my baby. And the night my grandfather walked through the door and said yes to both of us. That yes was enough to build an entire life on. And I have never stopped being grateful for it.